Aloha and welcome to our long-awaited educational session on the updated standard forms. My name is Julie Meyer. I am your 2024 Hawaii Association of Realtors President. The forms that we'll be reviewing today represent an enormous amount of hours put in by many individuals. There were over 15 committee and subcommittee meetings since April. There were additional meetings with legal counsel, side meetings, and many late night emails and calls. The committees included representation from all islands, brokers from small to large companies, and volunteers. All were dedicated to the goal of meeting the strict NAR settlement practice changes deadline. At this time on the screen, I'd like to introduce you to the members of the Standard Forms Committee. I'd also like to introduce you to the NAR Documents Subcommittee. These are the people who put in numerous hours. If you see them, please thank them. I've also heard that you should give them a hug and buy them a cup of coffee. But they worked really hard and you'll see the end results. Today, we're happy to bring you the collaborative end result of the committee's work. I'd like to introduce you to today's speakers. Jason Corta is our Hawaii Realtors Staff Counsel. Jason will be joined by Patrick O'Neill, Hawaii Realtors Chair of the Standard Forms Committee and NAR Documents Committee. With that, I'd like to turn this over to Jason Corta to start the session. Thank you, Jason.
Thank you, Julie. All right, so I kind of play the role of the heavy here. We have some stuff to get out of the way before we begin. We're about to enter into a very sensitive area. It's probably the most, in fact, it's definitely the most litigated topic within our industry for the past generation. Federal lawsuits and jurisdictions across the country have already produced $1 billion judgment and forced practice changes, controversial practice changes across the country. It's incredibly easy to produce additional liability for those who are participating on this panel today, or those in attendance. So before we get started, a disclaimer and some discussion rules. First, as to the disclaimer, no one in this panel is speaking for NAR. Although I'm an attorney, I don't represent anyone here, and nothing that is said or done here is intended to create an attorney-client relationship. The information provided during this webinar isn't legal advice, nor is it intended to be legal advice. Nothing said here is privileged, protected, or otherwise confidential. But we urge you to seek qualified, independent legal counsel, competent jurisdiction to answer all your legal questions. Okay. As to the rules. First, there can be no talk of current or future pricing strategies, or market allocation. That means no talk of commissions, rates, fees, or other competitive terms. Second, no one here will make any agreement or imply any understanding to divide or allocate markets, customers, or territories. Third, everyone here must avoid sharing or discussing proprietary or sensitive information that could influence the competitive behavior of those in attendance here today, or those who would otherwise receive this webinar. So no sharing of marketing strategies, confidential business plans, or the like. Fourth, and finally, everyone here must independently determine their business policies and practices. You must not engage in any collective activity that could restrict competition or artificially influence market conditions. All right, so why are we here? As many of you likely know, NAR entered into a national settlement agreement to protect you against claims by sellers of residential property. So if you're a realtor on a residential transaction between October 31st, 2019 and August 17th of this year in Hawaii, in which a cooperating broker commission was advertised on NMLS and later paid to the broker representing the buyer in that transaction, then this settlement agreement covers and protects you, but only to the extent that you adopt certain practice changes required by the settlement agreement. Those are we labored to incorporate these practice changes into our forms, and we're going to describe those changes to you here today. Very quickly, there will actually be 2 release dates. Both occur in August. The first release date will occur on August 1st of this year, obviously. It'll include 2 forms. the buyer representation contract notice, and the exclusive right to sell listing contract notice. Those are two new forms, and they're meant to help people who have either a listing contract or a buyer representation contract that's in effect now and will remain in effect after the settlement agreement practice changes go into effect. It's a way of bringing your current agreement into compliance with the settlement agreement, basically so the plaintiffs can't come after you. There will be a second release in August. That will occur on August 12th. And it will include all the other forms affected by the settlement agreement, as well as some other forms, I believe all of which we'll discuss here today. As far as training goes, we already have had 2 webinar trainings for principal brokers and brokers in charge. This is our first agent education webinar, but there will be 2 more when we provide this information. If you know someone who couldn't make it today, there are 2 more that they could attend. Those other 2 occur on August 2nd at 10 a.m. and on August 9th at 1 p.m. Watch our weekly e-news for information on how to join those webinars. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Jason. And we couldn't have done any of this without your help, so we truly appreciate all the efforts. My name is Patrick O'Neill. I'm the chair of the Hawaii Association of Realtors Standard Forms Committee, and during my day job, I am the principal broker owner of Luxury Homes International here in Honolulu, Hawaii. Thank you for taking the time to be here for this very important webinar. And as Jason mentioned, if you know of any agents who are unable to attend today, please encourage them to sign up for the future educational webinars or to watch this video in its entirety. And today we're going to talk about 2 parts. Part 1, we're going to look at the documents that have been revised that relate directly to the NAR settlement and the practice changes, which will be effective August 17th. In the second part, we're going to look over the newly revised purchase contract. That'll probably be a lot more fun. After each section, we will have a question and answer period. You can hit the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, and our Q&A sessions will be administered by the vice chair of the Standard Forms Committee, Phoebe Nikolakakis. We'll bring her up in just a moment. Okay. Jason just gave you a big disclaimer. I'm just going to give you one more. Nothing that I say here today should be considered legal advice. And if you are a licensee, please check with your principal broker and legal representatives for your company's policies and procedures. And I'll add one more caveat to this. Everything is fluid at the moment, as you probably know, subject to change and updates. Stay on top of this. The only thing I can say is be rest assured that the Hawaii Association of Realtors and the Standard Forms Committee will be ready if there are any changes and put you in the best position to succeed. Okay, let's talk about the NAR documents. If you haven't done so already, I highly recommend that you download the NAR FAQs. You can see the web address here on the screen. This will answer most of the questions that you have that relate to the NAR documents. If you haven't read the entire settlement agreement, read these 5 pages, 27 to 31. It will give you a good summary of the major changes that will be going into effect as of August 17th. If you read through the settlement, you'll see the words realtors, MLS participants, subscriber, real estate brokers. For ease of our discussion today, I'm just going to use the word realtor. And when responding to questions or as we have discussions about this section, I am just going to be referring to the NAR FAQ, which was updated on July 8th. Now, one of the practice changes prohibits offers of compensation on MLS to buyers, brokers, or other buyer representative. If you are using the matrix system in Honolulu, this box will no longer appear. There will be no place that you can put any compensation or offers of compensation to buyers, brokers in MLS. That includes in the special remarks. That would also include putting something in the supplemental documents. Now, compensation to buyer's broker, if any, may continue to take multiple forms. As an example, could be percentage of purchase price, could be a flat fee, could be hourly rate, it could be other. In addition, it could be paid through the listing broker. That's what a lot of us have been used to through using the cooperating brokerage firm separate agreement. It might be paid directly by the seller. It could, of course, be paid by the buyer and may take other forms. Now, sellers may offer concessions or credits on MLS as long as not limited to or conditioned on the retention of or payment to a buyer broker. So concessions can be on MLS, but no offers of compensation. Now, written buyer agreement is required before touring any home. This is one of the big changes. So there are two items that trigger the written buyer's rep agreement. Let's break it down. First is working with. When we talk about working with a buyer, and you can see an example given here in the NAR FAQs, such as identifying potential properties, arranging for showings, performing or negotiating on behalf of the buyer. That would be considered working with a buyer. And that is distinguished from someone who might be marketing their services or just talking to a buyer. For example, at an open house. We'll talk a little bit more about that. Another question that has come up frequently, what about authorized dual agents? If you are in an authorized dual agent situation, then you are working with the buyer, and that representation agreement would be required according to the NAR FAQs. What does it mean to tour a home? Again, I'm going to reference the NAR FAQs. You can see working with the buyer that enters the home physically to do a showing, obviously, but also you can see here, provide a live or virtual tour to a buyer who is not physically present. Additionally, you'll see on the third bullet point here, a definition of what is home. And a home here is a residential property between 1 and 4 residential dwelling units. Again, the question about open house. If you are a lister or you are an agent that works for the listing brokerage firm and you're sitting in open house, according to the NAR FAQs, you will not need to have everyone who enters the open house sign a buyer's representation contract. The reason being you are there working on behalf of the seller, you are not working with the buyer. The amount in the buyer's written agreement must be objectively ascertainable and not open-ended. Now, a big question that's come up. Can buyers and buyer brokers agree to a range of compensation? The NAR FAQ says no. It must be objectively ascertainable and open-ended. And just a footnote here, we're all watching different videos, training seminars. Be sure that you revert back to the settlement agreement itself in the NAFARQs for guidance. Now, the realtor may not receive compensation that exceeds the amount or rate agreed to in the buyer rep contract. This is going to be a big change compared to the current HAR agreement that we use right now. In the current buyer rep agreement, it says the broker will receive no less than a certain amount. Let me use an example. If in the current buyer's representation contract, the compensation was 20 coconuts, but the seller is offering 30 coconuts, under the current agreement, the buyer's broker could receive all 30 coconuts. That will not be the case going forward. Going forward, as of August 17th, if the buyer's representation contract states 20 coconuts, as an example, but the seller is offering 30 coconuts, the excess 10 coconuts cannot be received by the buyer's broker. Now, this disclaimer must appear in 3 different documents: the listing contract, buyer's representation contract, and any pre-closing documents. Must be in conspicuous language that broker commissions are not set by law and are fully negotiable. There is also a requirement, Jason touched on it earlier, about amending the buyer representation contracts that are going to straddle the August 17th date. So if you have a buyer's representation contract in place right now, before August 17th, you're going to need to amend that or you can use the notices that are being provided by NAR, which we will go over in just a moment. Okay, let's take a look at the actual documents themselves and what's been revised. Some of these will be very quick. Others are going to take a little time. When we talk about the revisions, all we have revised in these documents in this setting are the terms to comply with the NAR settlement. In some cases, we're trying to educate the realtor community as well through the use of the language that we use. And I'm not going to be reviewing the formatting changes here today. So starting with the short sale addendum, this one's pretty minor. We've just changed it to say brokerage firms are not obligated to negotiate commissions with lien holders for purposes of conducting. The VA addendum, a couple changes here. In paragraph 1, this is a citation that is required. Number 3 has been removed. Previously, termite inspection reports were considered a non-allowable. That is no longer the case. In paragraph 3, previously, broker fees and commissions were considered a non-allowable, something that the veteran was not allowed to pay. That has changed. The VA issued a circular in June of this year, which authorizes a temporary variance to that. So the veteran can pay the commissions or buyer broker's fees, but they cannot be included in the loan amount. If there are no funds available for the representation, then the veteran would have to pay that in cash at closing. Okay, let's look at the purchase contract. The changes to the purchase contract that relate to the NAR settlement are all found in Section C. First, the title has just been expanded to also say "and financial considerations," but here are the big changes. C3, seller concessions to buyer. This is a place in which a seller could offer a credit to the buyer, and the buyer could use that credit for whatever they would like, closing costs, other things. The other is the seller compensating directly to the buyer's brokerage firm through escrow. Now, one thing that's not here is what if the seller is going to compensate the buyer's broker through their listing brokerage firm? In that case, the cooperating separate brokerage firm agreement would be used. Now, you can see in both of these, there's an opportunity to just NA both of these. Sometimes we have questions, which one would we use? What would be best? That's something that we would not be able to discuss. These are just providing options for the various companies. And this final sentence here designates the buyer's broker as an intended third-party beneficiary, and that would give them the right to enforce paragraph C-4, where the seller is compensating directly to the buyer's broker. Okay, and if we look at the counteroffer, it is just going to mirror the language that we just went over in the purchase contract. This would allow for the parties to negotiate on these sections or to NA. Okay, moving to the listing contract. Here is that disclaimer that we talked about earlier. Broker commissions are not set by law and are fully negotiable. Now, A7, this is going to be a change in business practice compared to the current forms that we're using in the HAR standard forms library. A7 will be the total amount that will be paid to the listing brokerage firm. For example, using our current listing agreement, this might be a large number. For example, it might say 80 coconuts would be paid to the listing brokerage firm. And further on down the line, we might say if there's a cooperating brokerage firm, we will be sharing 40 of those coconuts to another party. In this case, using that same example, this would just read 40 coconuts. So this is the total amount that the listing brokerage firm will earn. This is now going to be separated from any offers of compensation to buyer or buyer's representative. So these are the other sections that we're going to look at. So again, A7, that's the amount that goes to the listing brokerage firm. A8, if there's any compensation to a buyer's brokerage firm, that would be in addition to A7. And A9 concessions, again, would be in addition to A7. We're going to go over both of these sections in a moment. A7B contemplates what happens if the buyer is unrepresented. They are coming as a customer. Well, the listing brokerage firm and the seller now will have that conversation up front and can predetermine if any additional compensation would be provided to the listing brokerage firm, and that would be in addition to A-7A up above. Okay, compensation to the buyer's brokerage firm. Now, you can see it has a checkbox. This could also be NA. The seller may say, I'm not providing any compensation to a buyer's brokerage firm. They could simply NA this particular box. But if they are going to offer compensation, this makes it very clear it will not be offered or disclosed on a multiple listing service. As you know, that would be prohibited. This also makes it clear that A8 compensation is in addition to the amount in A7. A7 is the amount that would be paid to the listing brokerage firm. Now, the compensation could be paid in several different ways. Could be A, paid through the listing broker, and that would be done with the use of the cooperating brokerage firm's separate agreement. Or it could be paid directly by the seller to the buyer's representative. Or C, a seller and the listing brokerage firm may decide that it will just be negotiated. I'm open to it, but I don't want to commit to any number up front. And you can see the end of this, that the final amount will be determined through the purchase contract, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. Now, concessions to buyer, which are credits to buyer. This is another alternative, another option perhaps a seller could do, making it clear that any concessions or credits offered here is in addition to A7, because A7, that's what the listing brokerage firm will be making. Now, the actual concessions are to be confirmed in a purchase contract between the seller and the buyer. And that's important, and we're going to talk a little more about it. And then there's two options that could be made. If the seller would like to show these concession offers on MLS, or it would be off of MLS. If it's on MLS, it cannot be conditioned on the retention of or payment to a cooperating broker, buyer broker, or other representative. Okay, we're going to shift gears over to the buyer representation contract. Here is that disclaimer language that needs to be there. There's really no change here in concept. We've just changed it around a little bit. This is just saying that the buyer's broker would be paid for any contracts that are written during the term of this agreement, and also any properties that are presented or identified during the term of the agreement. And there's now a time frame that you could put in there as far as how long that provision would last. The compensation. The buyer is guaranteeing the compensation amount to the buyer's broker for their service. What is underlined here makes it clear to the buyer that if there is no offer of compensation from any other party, then the buyer will have to pay the balance of the total compensation guaranteed. So if the buyer representation contract is set at 20 coconuts and the seller offers no coconuts, then the buyer will have to pay 20 coconuts at closing. If the seller is offering 10, then the buyer would have to make up the difference with the additional 10 coconuts. There's no change here on the initial consultation and research fee. Now, this is an important part of this, especially for you when you are the buyer's brokerage firm. Buyer's brokerage firm represents and warrants that it will not receive compensation for its brokerage services that exceeds the amount or rate agreed to under this agreement. Now, the buyer is going to represent and warrant a few items as well. Number one, that the buyer did not tour any property after August 17th before signing this agreement, because that's a part of the settlement. And that the buyer is not an exclusive, or is not in another exclusive real estate services agreement that would conflict with this buyer's representation contract. Okay, and now we look at the brokerage firm's separate agreement. We have two changes here. This is probably the most important part. Again, if you are on the buyer side of the transaction, Cooperating brokerage firm represents and warrants that the commissions under this paragraph does not exceed the amount or rate agreed to under the written agreement with the buyer. That's very important, and I think you all understand that. And this is a representation from the listing brokerage firm, which just mirrors some language that is in the settlement. Okay. Now, if you have an existing buyer's representation contract that is going to straddle the date, so you have an agreement in place right now, you need to make some changes to it. And the way that this is structured is a notice. And the difference of a notice to an amendment, a notice is something that the buyer's brokerage firm can simply deliver to the buyer, and it's done. It doesn't require their signatures. Probably better to get them, but it doesn't require them. So let's go through here. A notice effective date, August 17th. Here is that disclaimer, which now must appear in all the buyer's rep contracts. And here, reaffirming that the buyer's brokerage firm will not receive any amount that exceeds the amount in that buyer's representation contract. There's also a notice to existing listing contract, and there are some items that need to be disclosed there. Primarily, this disclaimer, right, needs to be in there. Broker commissions are not set by law and are fully negotiable. And furthermore, that any offer of compensation will no longer be published or offered through an MLS system. Whew, okay, we got through it. Let's do a Q&A. And we've been collecting questions prior to today's event. And I'm going to run through the most popular questions, and then I'm going to bring in Phoebe and Jason to join me. Actually, Phoebe and Jason, would you like to come on now? So this Phoebe Nikolakakis is the vice chair of the Standard Forms Committee, and we'll have Jason Korta here as well. And then I'm going to go through, and then Phoebe, you let us know if there's anything that we missed. Okay, so the biggest question's always been, what happens to the extra coconuts? So buyer's rep contract is at 20 coconuts. The seller is offering 30 coconuts. The short answer is those coconuts would remain with the seller. They cannot be received by the buyer's representation or the buyer's brokerage firm. Jason, do you have anything you want to add to that?
No, I don't. Thank you.
Okay. All right. Okay. Can the buyer's representation contract be amended? Okay. Been a big question. In a general sense, contracts, for the most part, can be amended if the parties agree. When we're talking about real estate contracts between brokerage firms and clients, we must be sure that we comply with Article 1, which is putting our clients' and customers' best interests ahead of our own. And there are also some legal considerations that may need to be considered. Jason, is anything you'd like to add to that one?
No, that's perfect too. Thank you, Patrick.
Okay, all right, okay. Okay, can a range be used in the buyer's rep contract, such as 15 to 40 coconuts? Or could we use language, can we insert to X coconuts or not to exceed X coconuts in the BRC? I'm just going to refer to the NAR FAQ that you cannot use a range of compensation according to the NAR. And there's an argument to be made that if you say insert 2 X coconuts, that would be 0 to X, or not to exceed would also be a range. Now, can a percentage of purchase price or a flat fee or an hourly rate be used in the buyer's representation contract? And the answer is yes. There's no restrictions on what you can use there. Is a buyer representation agreement required in dual agency or designated agency situations? According to the NAR FAQ, the answer would be yes to both of those if it is an authorized dual agency or authorized designated agency situation. Now, does the settlement apply to commercial properties? I'm going to reference the NAR FAQs, and this is kind of peculiar language. It says most commercial transactions will not be affected. It further in the same paragraph says the settlement prohibits offers of compensation on an MLS and requires MLS participants work with buyers into a buyer's agreement. In a similar paragraph, does the requirement to use a written agreement before showing apply to commercial transactions? According to the FAQ 87, no. The settlement and practice change, it requires our focus on residential, not commercial transactions or leases. So that's something you'll have to check with your principal broker and legal representative how you want to handle that. Does the settlement apply to vacant residential land? Don't have a direct answer for this. I can point to 57 in the NAR FAQs, which they're talking about a home, which is 1 to 4 residential dwelling units, but I'm not 100% sure, and I don't think there's anything that has a direct answer. Jason, do you want to add anything to that on the residential land?
So, like Patrick said, there's no way we can give you a direct answer to that, and I'm sorry about that. One of the main reasons is that it's not an issue that's expressly addressed in the settlement agreement itself. So any answer that we did give you would be a conclusion of law based on the information provided in the settlement agreement, which we can't do here. I could point out, though, however, that the release claims under the settlement agreement are all those claims that are made in connection with the sale of any residential home.
Right, good. Thank you for that. Thank you for adding that. So yeah, little unsure there. Okay. Does the buyer's agent need to provide the buyer's representation contract to the listing broker? Jason, do you want to handle that one?
Oh, thank you. Sorry, I had to read it for a second.
Okay.
Wake up, Jay. So the answer to that is no. We took some pains to make sure that there was a way that that document could remain confidential, if necessary, to adhere to your fiduciary responsibilities to your client. But if your client thinks it's appropriate and it doesn't breach any fiduciary duty you have with them to maintain like negotiations with the client, confidential, then there is nothing prohibiting it. So long answer short, nothing prohibiting it or requiring it. It would be up to you and your client on an ad hoc basis.
Great, thank you. Thank you for that. All right. Can concessions be offered on an MLS? So can concessions, meaning credits, be shown on an MLS? The short answer, according to the NAQs, is yes, but they cannot be limited to or conditioned upon the retention of or payment to a cooperating broker, buyer broker, etc. So concessions can be shown on MLS, but there are the restrictions there. Jason, anything you want to add to that?
No, thank you.
Okay, all right.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Okay.
One thing.
Yeah.
We can't speak for the individual MLSs, but it's my understanding that HBR will not allow concessions to be advertised on the MLS there. I check with them to confirm, but I believe that's what I heard on that issue. Just FYI.
Okay. All right. Are concessions offered in the MLS binding on the seller? Now, that's a good question. Now, this is from the NAR FAQs. As a general matter, you can see here, seller concessions usually aren't binding until they're established in an executed contract, such as a listing agreement or a purchase contract. And I'm just going to go to the next slide here. This is our listing contract in the way we've written it for the concessions section. Actual concessions are to be confirmed in a purchase contract between the buyer and the seller. So Jason, do you want to add anything to this question in general?
I can give some quick background on that. So Patrick's right to point out that section that we added to the purchase contract. We did think of this scenario and we put that section in there to ensure that you can sue to enforce your rights if it's necessary. Very quickly, the basis behind this, because it's not something that's commonly litigated, but it's firmly established in law. And what's called a quote unquote intended third party beneficiary to a contract can sue to enforce their rights. So let's say that I promise Patrick that I'll paint BB's house for $500. Patrick gives me the $500, and it's only Patrick and I on the contract. Patrick pays me the $500, but then I abscond. I don't, I just run away with the money. Phoebe can sue me if the contract is written appropriately, even though she's not part of the contract, because she's a quote unquote intended third-party beneficiary. She was supposed to benefit from the contract. Patrick was paying me to paint her house. She's the beneficiary. So that's basically what we did to the purchase contract. Although the brokers remains not a party to the contract, they can sue to enforce their rights to a commission on the contract because of the language that Patrick points to right there.
Okay, all right, thank you for that. So just, in conclusion on this, our concessions offered binding on the seller. According to the NAR FAQ and the way we've written the document, they would need to be confirmed in the purchase contract. Okay.
Oh, oops. Sorry.
Yep.
Go ahead. Yeah.
What if the seller and listing broker are not offering any compensation or credits to pay the buyer's brokerage firm? Well, in that case, it would be up to the buyer to bring those funds to escrow or any shortfall thereof. Now, what if the buyer refuses to sign an agreement? Jason, why don't you take that one?
Then you can't work with them, unfortunately.
This is the best graphic I could find for that. Okay, so yeah. Okay, so yes. So if they refuse to sign, you cannot work with that buyer. It's just that simple. Okay, Phoebe, how did we do? Do you have any other questions that have come in?
I do. And so one of them, someone asked us to put up the link to the NAR FAQ. So we have done that in the chat if you want to go and pull that up. One of the recurring questions has to do with open house. If you're sitting in an open house and if you're not the listing agent, what are your responsibilities for buyer's rep contracts, etc.?
Okay, I'll relate to the NAR FAQs. If you are working for the seller, meaning maybe it's not your listing, but you work for the same company, as long as you're not working for the buyers as they walk in the door, they do not need to have a buyer's representation contract. If you're there working on behalf of the seller, do not need to have a buyer's representation contract. Jason, anything you want to add to that?
No, not
okay,
at all.
All right.
Yeah.
Okay. When are the notices going to be available for the general realtor population?
August 1st.
Okay. And until then, nothing?
Right. Our vendors, so that would be loan off, otherwise known as a form, and forms off have to what they call design the forms, which is we give them the originals and they have to design it for their system, upload it, incorporate it into their transaction management platform. And they got to send us back copies for us to prove to make sure you get the right thing, because it doesn't always occur that way. And then it's released. So basically we're in that second step there where everything's being confirmed to make sure that it's perfect before it goes out to you, but it will be available in less than a week, it looks like.
Okay. Can you talk a little bit about videos, video tours, what's required? Let's say a listing agent sends out a video tour of the property, or an agent does a video tour. Is there a buyer's rep contract required?
Go back to the NAR FAQs. Doing a virtual tour, if you're working with the buyer, would trigger the buyer representation contract. Jason, you're shaking your head yes. Anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, I think that's the crux there. Are you working with them at the time? If you are, then it would likely trigger it. Although, again, this is not something that's expressly covered in the settlement agreement. It is what NAR's general guidance is on that issue.
Okay. Let's see. We've had some questions about condos that are vacation rentals, and are they included in?
We're referring to purchase and sale of residential, and if it's a dwelling unit of 1 to 4 units, then it would be covered in the settlement agreement. I don't think there's any language in the settlement that relates to property management or leasing. Would you concur with that, Jason?
That's correct. Yeah, I would.
Yeah,
I do.
Yeah. So if you were buying or selling a dwelling unit, including a vacation rental, it would probably be covered.
Okay. Bunch of questions about who's going to verify that the buyer's rep contract exists?
The enforcement is entirely up to the MLSs. So that's the enforcement entity. You'd have to check with your MLSs. as far as how they are going to administer and handle that. On our cooperating buyers separate agreement, cooperating brokers separate agreement, we have an affirmation from the buyer's firm that they are not exceeding the amount in their buyer's rep contract.
Okay. How would an agent find out what compensation is being offered if it's not on the MLS? And how do we get started filling out the purchase contract?
That would be up to your principal broker and your legal representatives as far as how your company will be handling those situations.
Okay. I know we answered some of these questions, so pardon me, there's a lot of questions coming our way here.
Okay.
Can you talk about GET a little bit? If somebody just put in X coconuts, do they have to add X coconuts plus GET in
Again,
order
that's
to be
a
able to receive that?
company policy, company decision, not appropriate for our conversation today.
Okay, thank you. Let's see. Okay, I guess. Okay, so today after the session's over, you guys will get in an email the link to the FAQs. So it didn't come up in the chat. I'm sorry that was disabled. So watch for it after the this webinar. Also, are we sending out a copy of the webinar as well as the slides? Can you confirm that, please?
The webinar
Yes.
itself will be going out, but not the slides. You can view the slides on the video. And the main reason there, we just don't want it taken out of context.
Okay.
All right. Well, shall we wrap it up there? And we're going to jump into something more fun, the purchase contract. Is there anything else in there, Phoebe?
I think there's a lot of repetition just in a different.
Okay. Take
Each
a look at
question's a
it.
little differently formed.
Okay. All right. We'll take a look at that. We're going to jump into the revisions to the purchase contract, and then we'll have another Q&A session. Jason and Phoebe, thank you very much for coming on. And for our Q&A for the purchase contract, we have a special surprise celebrity guest, so stand by for that. Okay. Let us clean our palette from NAR and shift gears over into the newly revised purchase contract. And the good news is it's still 14 pages, but I think you'll really like the changes that have come about. Just going to do the disclaimer again. Nothing I say here should be considered legal advice. Please check with your principal broker and legal representatives for your company's policies and procedures. A huge thank you to the former committees who have prepared our purchase contracts for all these years. Immediate past chair of the Standard Forms Committee, Dusty Woodstock, and the purchase contract subcommittees that have come before us. The last time the purchase contract was revised was approximately 5 years ago. Kalama Kim was chairing the subcommittee at that time. So thank you to all of you. These are the brokers that were involved with the purchase contract revisions. Like Julie said earlier, a lot of blood, sweat, and tears, late night phone calls, emails, dozens and dozens of meetings. So thank you very much to everyone that was on the purchase contract subcommittee. We also had advisors that helped us. You can see the lenders here. Lisa Taramoto was our liaison to the Mortgage Bankers Association, Anders Hostel at Guaranteed Rate. And on the title and escrow side, Jeremy Trueblood from TG, Patsy Psyche, First American. You can see Craig Endo there as well. We also reached out to the Hawaii Real Estate Commission and Lynn Morrison at Professional Standards at HBR. But the most important part of the revision process are the member comments. Before we began the revisions, we had collected over 200 comments and suggestions. Every single one of those is reviewed, or they were reviewed. After the drafts were available, we sent the purchase contract out for additional comments from the membership twice. We received another 120 comments and suggestions. So thank you to all of you that take the time to respond. And during your daily business, if you find something in any document that you think should be revised, please contact HAR, send that into our committee so we can see that. The types of changes in the contract, we're going to see there's technical, legal, and grammar. There's clarification of existing terms, and there's changes in current practice. I'm not going to go over any of the technical, legal, and grammar, but we'll really pause on the ones which are practice changes. This is an example of some of the legal and grammar. changing shall to will or must, and I know that will be a question in the end. That's a Jason Corta one. And then some formatting, which will make counters a little easier. Okay, let's jump into it. Here we go. First change, initial earnest money deposit. We've simplified it. You no longer have to describe how the buyer will be bringing the initial earnest money deposit, just the time frame in which it must be delivered to escrow. In section C, we just looked at this in addition to the headline. Now, additional deposit in the new version is capitalized, meaning it's a defined word. When we get to paragraph O-1, I'll explain why, but just bear that in mind, C2 right there. Okay, these are the two changes we just went over that relate to the NAR settlement and practice changes, so I'm not going to go through those. In D1, we have added two new addenda, the backup offer and also the sight unseen addenda, which are now available in the standard forms library. In section E-2, a couple of changes. Attached carpeting has been changed to attached flooring materials, and the addition to microwave hood. And I know one of the questions is, can't you have this line up with my MLS input form? Unfortunately, all the MLSs are different, and they don't all line up together. So we've just kept it in alphabetical order. Photovoltaic system and security alarm system have been removed from section E2. Those now have separate paragraphs, which we'll review in a moment. This is an example of the formatting. So we've just added some letters, identifiers here to make the countering process more simple. This is a brand new paragraph, which is the inclusion of photovoltaic systems. I'm not going to go through this in detail, but in essence, the documents, if they're available, will be provided by the seller X days after acceptance date, and the buyer will have X days for review, very similar to an M1 situation or a seller's disclosure statement. Now, the security alarm systems is set up a little differently. In this particular case, the purchase contract will require that it will be a part of the seller's disclosure statement. F1, a couple of important changes here. The first one is the word closing is now capitalized with a capital C. Previously, it was a small c. So if you're using documents and using this defined word, you'll need to update those documents in your company. And this is the bigger change. If either party fails to perform whatever is needed to close with escrow, the other party can at that point declare the default. Prior to this being inserted, we would have to wait until the closing date when the party defaulted. So it's just going to push that up a few extra days. This is another big change. The term scheduled closing date has been completely removed from the purchase contract. The only thing you will see now is closing date. And if you have dealt with this before and the confusion that ensued, I know that you'll like this a lot. So if you're using any documents, company documents that have the word schedule closing date, be sure that you update those to just referencing closing date. This is a big change, one of the most popular, most requested changes, dealing with the unilateral right to extend, F3A. Currently, if either party uses any portion of F3A, that's it. It could not be used any further. This is changed in concept. For example, if F3A says 10 days, if one party uses 1 day, the other party can use 9 days. Or if one party uses 2 days, the other party could use 2 days, and the other party could use 1, back and forth until that whole amount is used up. So if we had 10 days here, it can continue to be used by either party until the maximum amount. This is just clarifying some of the prorations and closing adjustments, and including association billed utilities. This was just clarification in the closing costs, the discount points and mortgage fees. We've deleted the reference to FHA or VA. This would apply to all loans. And then we have used the correct terms for FERPTA and HARPTA. They're not a tax, they're actually just a withholding. F7, notice on conveyance tax. There's no change in content here, but just making it a little clearer to use in the different selections that the buyer might make. Okay, F8. This one is important. This deals with assessments. And if you have dealt with this issue before, I think you will appreciate this. There are basically three types of assessments that you could run into. One assessment is a lump sum assessment. This could either be paid in full by the seller or it could be assumed by the buyer at closing. That one's pretty straightforward. The second one is an assessment that is being paid in installments, and it either has a known end date or it has a lump sum option. With that type of an assessment, it could be paid in full by the seller at closing, or it could be prorated by escrow, and you can see the selections there. This is the new one that's added, and this was the one creating the problems. These are assessments being paid in installments that do not have a known end date, and they do not have a lump sum payment option. Those going forward will now automatically be prorated as of the date of closing. G1, this was just using the proper language given to us by the title company. G2, clarification from the title company. What we're looking for is not just marketable title, but insurable title. This one is very popular. I think you'll like this. You're now submitting an offer that is all cash. You can just say attached with this purchase contract are the proof of funds. You don't have to figure out where to write that in anymore. So I think this will just make it a lot simpler if you're attaching proof of funds with the purchase contract. Two, we've added the term obtaining hard money or / private loan under contingency on obtaining cash funds. This is in part to help educate agents who were putting an all cash purchase when in fact it was a hard money loan. So we're just clarifying that and hoping that that will help to educate a little bit. H3, using the appropriate language, it will now be called an approval letter, not a commitment letter. This comes directly from the Mortgage Bankers Association. And there was kind of a strange thing that could happen here with the buyer's obligations to deliver. Previously, you had to deliver a conditional loan commitment letter that contained both underwriter appraisal and underwriter approval and appraisal, but most lenders were not issuing that letter with both components to it. So it's now separate. It can be issued together or separately, but still within X amount of days. Under the mandatory seller's disclosure, this is providing a provision that if the seller does not provide the disclosure statement within the time period, then the buyer may terminate under O-3. Previously, this was an O-1 default termination provision. Okay, I3, this is an important change. Under the current purchase contract, there was the possibility where you could have conflicting dates after receiving an amended disclosure statement. So we've done two things here. One, we've simplified the date that will be used here. Now there'll be one date that will administer a receipt of a disclosure statement or receipt of an amended disclosure statement or buyer's later discovery of inaccurate information. And you can see it will all be one date here, I3-B. Under general disclosures, just making buyers aware that if they do purchase a property that has permit issues, that they could also become responsible for those issues after conveyance of the property. We've added wildfires to the climate change and natural hazards section in the disclosures. And we've also added the abandoned wells paragraph. We don't see a lot of this on Oahu, but it is prevalent on the neighbor islands. If you are not sure about the abandoned wells statute, that's a subject matter that you need to be up to date on if you have a property or a listing or a buyer that's buying something with an abandoned well. And we're not going to go through that here today. J9, this was also very popular, bringing back the good old cleaning credit. So in lieu of cleaning, the seller could now offer a cleaning credit. And the language here towards closing costs or other prepaid expenses only, that's the language we received from the Mortgage Bankers Association. This was cleaning up the animal-related treatment, changing it to X days before closing. Previously had X days after closing, and also requiring that all the animals be removed and not returned to the property after treatment other than assistance animals. K2, this is an important change. Currently, the way that the paragraph is written, a map would be provided only if improvements exist along the property line. This has just changed it to make sure that a map is provided whether there are improvements existing on the property line or not. I think that's been the common practice anyway. K3 is changed. This is an important change. K3 previously, if an encroachment was found, the seller was required to get an encroachment agreement. And as we all know, that doesn't happen all the time. This is now changed to say that the buyer may elect to terminate the purchase contract within X days of discovery of the encroachment. So within that time period, the buyer can either decide to accept it with the encroachment or negotiate something else with the seller. K4, just a change to the heading there. M1, this is an important change. Nothing has changed below. This is all statutory language down below, but we've included a new provision that when the documents are provided, they must be provided also with an itemized list of those documents. I think most companies do that already, but we're making that a requirement under the purchase contract. M2, we've just brought it into the modern era. We've taken out the CD and DVDs, and you can see the changes in here, and then also added the formatting to allow for easy negotiations. Now, documents issued during the escrow period, there is now a time frame in which the seller must provide those to the buyer. Previously, there was no time frame, and apparently some sellers would wait till just before closing to dump the documents. But now, once the seller receives something or is aware, they have X days to provide that to the buyer. N1, we've added the word "and occupant," so it must be free and clear of tenants and occupants, and you can obviously see why that's in there. Okay, O1. So we're going to go, I had mentioned when we looked at C-2 to remember additional deposit, and this is where it comes into play. Additional deposit is now a defined word along with initial earnest money deposit. One of the cures or one of the actions that the seller can bring under default would be the retention of the earnest money deposit and the additional deposit. Previously, when it was not capitalized, some sellers would make the argument that additional deposit meant all funds that had been put into escrow, including the cash funds. This will just clarify that point under the O1 default provision. Under HARPTA, we have just updated it to use the proper terminology. This came from our escrow partners. And the same with FERPTA, just updating it to use the proper terminology. Fair housing, this was just updated by our staff attorney. Nothing too exciting in there. Okay, and there are a series of updated addenda and documents. It looks like a big list, but actually on most of these, it's just changing the word scheduled closing date to closing or capitalizing the word closing. And we had looked earlier at the cooperating brokerage firm separate agreement. So the changes there are just there's the language to comply with NAR. And then the extension of scheduled closing date, we've just inserted language to match the F3A, which we went over recently. Okay, let's bring back our panel. So we're going to bring back Phoebe Nikolakakis, who is going to moderate our Q&A section. Jason Corta And then we have a special guest, a very familiar face. There he is, Kalama Kim, man who needs no introduction. Phoebe, are you there? Oh, there she is. All right. Okay,
I
Phoebe.
am. I've been
Okay.
studying the questions closely.
All right.
So I have a few. I'm going to keep an eye on what keeps coming up. One of the
Okay.
questions was about the PV in E5. Are we supposed to provide PV documents and information if it's a condominium?
Kalama, you want to take that one?
Are we supposed to provide the condominium documents if it is a condominium? I'm gonna use
Photovoltaic documents.
Say that again, Phoebe.
The photovoltaic documents.
The PV documents, yeah. And I'm gonna say my favorite answer, it depends. Now, usually in single family homes, you're providing the PV documents. In the future contract on August 12th, you're going to do that because that new paragraph 5 requires it. Currently, the seller's disclosure statement for the seller instructs them to provide that if it's a home system. Now, if it's a condominium, I would say it depends because you have some condominiums. I know of one on Oahu where the association allows individual unit owners to put, and this is a townhome, the PV on their roof on the townhome, so they would have all the documents to provide. I would think if it's a large condominium, that's going to be included in the condominium documents, and the individual unit owner doesn't have control themselves. That was a really long answer. I hope depends plus all that other stuff helped.
Okay, it sounds good. Phoebe, next one.
This is more of a comment, so I thought perhaps the concessions versus commissions. My take from this question is they're asking about what's in C3 and C4, so maybe help to understand that a little bit better.
Okay.
I read that question. I think it's a Jason Corda question. Jason, is there a difference between concessions or credits as it's used in terms of settlement, and can they be used interchangeably? Because it's only used as concessions, revised contract.
I think concessions and credits can likely be used interchangeably, but concessions and commissions or cooperating broker commission payments cannot. So there's a distinction between a commission and a concession. Concession would be for the benefit of the buyer, and the buyer could use the concession as appropriate, and the cooperating broker commission, of course, would be for the benefit of the broker representing the buyer.
For clarity, Jason, you mean that if the seller's crediting a buyer, then they can use the word concession or credit, but if the buyer would give a credit to the seller, it wouldn't be used as a concession? Is that what you meant?
I'm sorry, on that I didn't follow.
Well, I'll tell you what, let's go into more next question, Phoebe.
Okay, someone was asking for more detail on F1. So what did you share on F1? That was closing date.
Okay, so the two changes for that relate on F1, one change is that the word closing has been capitalized. And the second is allowing a party to declare default if it's obvious the other party has not performed under the duties required by escrow. So maybe as an example, if it's the day before escrow, the buyer hasn't funded any money, they haven't signed any documents, it's obviously they're not going to be able to record the following day. At that point, the other party could declare a default. Previously, we had to wait until closing date until they default.
Okay, I have some questions going back to the NAR, and it has to do with a listing agent getting a call from an unrepresented buyer or someone who won't sign a buyer's rep contract. Can they go ahead and show their listing to that unrepresented buyer?
Yeah, according to the NAR FAQs, if they're working on behalf of the seller, they can show an unrepresented buyer the property without establishing a buyer's representation contract. Kalama, do you want to add something to that?
Just to add to that process, once they and you'd mentioned this earlier, once you If the listing agent starts working with the buyer, then at that point, they'd want to execute a buyer's written agreement.
Yeah, good
Would
point.
that also apply to a virtual tour if a listing agent sent a virtual tour out?
If they're not working with the buyer, then they are not meeting the criteria. So they have to be working with the buyer and then touring a property. So if it's an unrepresented buyer and you're working on behalf of the seller or behalf of the listing side, I don't think there would be a buyer's representation contract required.
Can I add to that one too?
Please.
On the other flip side, if it's a represented buyer, then virtually touring the property, if you're working with them and touring the property, as if that's the definition, then you want that written agreement before that virtual tour of the property is presented.
Yes, good point. Okay, Phoebe.
Okay. Going back to the buyer's rep contract, if a buyer receives a concession from the seller, can the buyer use that concession to pay the buyer's rep agreement? And whatever else they want to use it for.
We're both shaking our head. Yes.
Yeah,
Yeah,
all three.
short answer. Yeah, go ahead, Jason.
I'm sorry, Patrick. I think all three of us were nodding approval to that. The only thing I would mention, though, is that the concession that's offered can't be made conditioned on that buyer hiring or paying their broker or retaining their broker. So the concession once paid can be used for that purpose. It's just it can't be a situation where the listing agent says, look, I'll give you this, but only if you retain this broker or only if you use it to pay this broker. It can be used for that purpose, just it can't be conditioned like that.
Yeah,
Okay.
very important distinguishing. So if a unrepresented buyer is asking for the credit, you as a listing agent can say, the seller will give you the credit, but you must have a broker representing you. Cannot do that if you're offering the credit.
Okay, next question has to do with unrepresented buyer. Can the buyer buy the purchase contract from HAR, or what do you recommend?
The purchase contract is for use of realtors. So a non-licensee doesn't have access to the purchase.
So how do you see that playing out?
There are no plans on changing that.
So if an unrepresented buyer comes and wants to buy the property, what happens next?
Well, if the seller is a realtor, they have access to that, and it's probably in the best interest of the listing agent to write up the offer in favor of the seller or to provide it for that property.
Okay. Any other questions, Phoebe?
Let's see. Does the buyer's rep contract need to be sent to escrow for them to confirm the amount that the buyer brokerage will receive?
Jason, you want to take that one?
I'm aware of no rule that would require that. Perhaps the escrow themselves would promulgate a rule that would require it, in which case you probably would have to comply to make sure the transaction closes. But there is no rule in the law that I'm aware of that would require that.
Patrick, can I give my favorite answer?
Please, yes.
It
depends.
It depends in a scenario where under the buyer's written agreement, the buyer is going to pay their own representative because they didn't get it offset by the seller or the listing brokerage paying it, or a credit from seller to buyer, then escrow is going to have some provenance to show that payment is due to the brokerage firm. So it depends, Patrick.
Yeah. All right, Phoebe, next one.
Okay, next one. Question about, wouldn't it be implied agency if the seller agent writes an offer for an unrepresented buyer?
We don't have to cover that. That's agency
Okay.
issues, another seminar.
Okay. Can the listing agent require that the buyer come with a buyer's rep only?
Can you say that again?
Okay. Can the listing agent require that the buyer be represented? only.
It's the only part that I guess gets me a little turned around. But could you say the question is, can the listing agent require that the buyer be represented?
Yes, you can say that.
I think it would be safer for the seller to do that because it's the seller's transaction. If the listing agent required it, there could be some antitrust concerns. I'm not saying there would be, but there could be. It would be safer, I think, for the seller to make that requirement if that is what you wanted.
Okay. I believe many agents get web leads. How are they supposed to get a buyer to sign the buyer's rep agreement? Do you do that before you answer any questions?
So that would be a business practice that we're not going to discuss here. That'd be up to each company, their policies and procedures. But just under the requirement, if you are working with a buyer and you are showing either virtually or in person, you'll need to have that buyer's representation contract. Kalama, you want to add something?
I was going to say the same exact thing that you said.
Okay. It depends.
No.
Yeah.
That was the other one.
All right.
Okay. A lot of questions about open house situations. If you're not the listing agent and you're sitting, do you need to get a buyer's rep contract signed?
Kalama, you want to take that one?
And this is the situation where if you're a listing agent and then you have someone else sitting in the open house, Phoebe, trying to clarify the question.
Yes, you have somebody else. And this
Okay.
would be from your own brokerage. I have some questions about if they're from another brokerage, but
Okay, let's say you have an open house sitter that is not the listing agent. Someone walks in that's a buyer and you ask them which you're required to under the code of ethics and say, are you party to an exclusive representation agreement? And they say no. At the point that you can identify you're working with them. So let's say then you go into they say, well, can you help me? And you talk about dual agency. And then after that, they say, I want you to help me. I want to work with you. Then you're at that point, you would be working with them and you would sign a buyer's representation contract if you're going to go and write an offer. So it's what Patrick had just said before, it's working with and touring properties. So in this case, when you're hosting an open house, when the working with starts, then at that point, it would turn on that switch to get that agreement.
And I'll add, if you, according to the FAR NAQ, if you are just talking to a buyer or if you're marketing to a buyer, you're not working with them yet. But as Kalama touched on, there's some things that would trigger that, and now you are working with.
okay. Going back to some of the NAR questions, can a buyer's agreement be amended?
I think we covered that, but
Okay.
the short answer is most agreements can be amended if the parties agree. In this case, because we're real estate companies talking about customers and clients, we have to put Article 1 front for center. We have to put the client's interest ahead of our own. Kalama, can you add to that, embellish that a little bit?
I can, because I do teach the code of ethics class that was just revamped, at least at one of the board of realtors. And there's an example in there that talks about you never put your interest above the client, because Article 1 is to protect and promote our client. So if you're going to amend a written contract, is it for the purposes of protecting, promoting your client, or is it for the purposes of promoting yourself and in there doing the opposite of protecting and promoting your client? So if that's the case, then you really have to ask yourself, should you be amending this contract?
I'll put it on too, if you don't mind, to support what Kalama is saying. In the law, so separately, but supporting what Kalama is saying, you can't make an agreement or an amendment to an agreement unless there is some kind of give and take. There's what the law calls consideration. So for instance, if you amend an agreement, a buyer representation agreement, and the buyer agrees to amend it, they have to be amending it for some kind of consideration for it. They have to benefit by it somehow. So in addition to the ethics rules that Kalama mentioned, there would also possibly be a concern that the amendment wouldn't be legally enforceable if the buyer didn't receive some type of benefit from it, right? can be loose what the benefit can be, but it is a concern. So I would make sure that not only you can comply with the ethics rules that Kalama mentioned, but also make sure that the buyer is somehow better positioned because of this amendment so that you can enforce this agreement for a higher commission.
And let me just pose something, and I know we don't want to talk about practice changes. If the agreement was being amended to a lower amount, that would probably be to the benefit of the client or the customer, right? Would we kind of all agree with that? If it was not being amended downward, then it becomes a question mark.
I think I agree with that, Patrick, because if you're amending, if both parties make the choice to amend down, you are protecting and promoting your client.
Okay, Phoebe?
Okay. We have a few questions along the lines of what if the buyer doesn't want to sign the buyer's rep contract? Can we still work with them? We don't work with them. And
Kalama, you want to take that one?
Well, I still remember your slide that you put up on the screen, Patrick. And this was the slide that asked the question, what if they don't want to sign the buyer written agreement? And it was that sad child's face. And as a father, I've seen that face over and over through the years. Now there is a caveat to that though. So the answer again would be no. If you can't be working with them and tour properties. I think they may be asking the other question is, what if you're working with them, but you never tour the property? That would be a question for Jason. And that might be the question to seek your own legal counsel because NAR is silent on that in the facts.
So I agree that you should seek your own legal counsel on this because that would be a conclusion of law, which we can't give here. But I would point out that the trigger expressly provided within the settlement agreement is that you are working with the client and toward the property, right, or toward the home. So take from that what you will, but yeah.
okay. A couple other things that came up earlier was the forms are being released August 12th. That was a question that someone had. They'll be released through zip forms.
Yes.
And then August 17 was the other date. What if there's a transaction that is currently in escrow and is closing August 30? What happens?
So we already touched on buyer's representation contract needs to be amended, listing contract needs to be amended if it's straddling the dates. And then Jason, do you want to touch on if something is in escrow? Does anything need to happen?
Well, if you don't have a buyer representation contract, that's not an issue that's covered by the settlement agreement. It would probably be better for you to have it. Again, I don't want to make a conclusion of law here for you, so I would seek your attorney. But I'm not sure if I follow the escrow concern there.
I can chime in a bit.
Yeah.
And the scenario is, if August 12th and August 17th happen and you're in escrow, let's say you're representing the buyer, and you close on August 30th, that's the scenario that Phoebe was talking about. On August, you may want to check your MLS rules and make sure you have a cooperating brokerage separate contract signed. Because if the rules change on August 17th at the latest, and you don't have a cooperating brokerage separate contract signed, and your MLS has eliminated that their compensation rules, then you want documents to make sure that you have the agreement of cooperating brokerage between the two brokerage.
Good point. And as far as I can tell, the NAR FAQs do not address if there's any modification needed if you are in escrow and don't have a buyer's representation contract.
I have more buyer's rep contract questions. Can somebody have multiple buyer's rep contracts signed, say one for the North Shore, one for the South Side, something like that?
Short answer is yes. And I think we have included now an expanded section that you can select which area that you might have.
Okay. Someone asked again, the NAR FAQs will be included when we send out the copy of this webinar
Yeah,
later
I think we should be
today.
able to provide a link to that page. Yeah, and if you go back and watch the video replay, it's right at the very beginning.
Yeah.
And
And then
just,
go ahead.
I've gone there so many times. If you go to facts, that's FACTS.realtor, and then scroll down, scroll all through the commentary. And then in this area that has all these white buttons as links to document, you choose the one that says settlement FAQ, then that's going to give you the 70 plus Q&A that they have there, facts.realtor.
Go. All right, Phoebe, we'll start to wrap it up. Maybe a couple more.
If I'm sending auto emails, do I need to have an agreement with that person, a buyer's rep contract, in order to do that? Auto emails.
I don't think you're acting for the benefit of the person you're sending the email to with their consent and subject to their control, right? You're not, I think that would be a stretch to say that you're working for them because you sent them an email. Again, I can't make a conclusion for you. You should speak to your own attorney, but it does seem like that would be a stretch.
Unless you're working with them and you're already touring properties with them. You have to do that before you tour properties.
That, sure.
And you're working with them, you need the buyer's agreement.
Okay. We're getting repeat questions. So
Okay, right. Maybe one more, Phoebe.
Let's see.
All right. Well, we don't have to
Yeah.
so we can wrap it up right here then. We'll wrap it up then. So Kalama, Kim, thank you very much for coming on, adding your insights and your wisdom, and thanks for all your help through this whole process, getting these documents together. Phoebe, you too, thank you for everything that you've done throughout this whole process. Great job moderating the Q&A. Jason Corda, thank you for everything you do all year long. Tremendous task that you've taken on. And for everyone who's joined today, please be sure to spread the word. We need to get this out to all the realtors in our community to elevate our profession at this moment in time. So until next time, from the Standard Forms Committee, be well, be kind, and aloha.